I'm fending off texts. I'm fending off texts from by saying, I'm about to podcast.
Just wait for the podcast. Seriously.
All your questions will be answered and more.
Take a chill pill. Extensive cohort of Australian lamestream media.
Mainstream media who couldn't be turning up to the COP and then hassle all of us constantly about what's going on at the COP.
If you can't persuade your bosses to give you the budget to come to Brazil, you can't persuade me to gazump my own podcast by telling you shit.
Correct.
Was that recorded, Luke?
Stick that in your stick that in your pipe and smoke it.
Maybe bleep out any names that may have been dropped. Pretty fast and loose here at the Copacabana offsite.
This is Let Me Sum Up, your annual deep dive into the outcomes, such as they are from the UNFCCC Conference of Parties. I'm Luke Menzel, recording live from our LMSU Airbnb at COP30 in Belém, Brazil, joined today by two co-hosts. It's LMSU's Global Vice President for being in rooms at the COP she is technically not supposed to be in, Frankie Muscovich. Hello, Frankie.
I contest that slightly because...
That's all part of your powers.
That's right.
Of deception and ninjutsu.
I think I've just got a friendly face is really what it comes down to.
I can confirm. Your face is very friendly.
Yeah. Yes. Have been in some places over the last couple of days and I'm ready to spill the tea on all of that.
Spill the tea. We are also joined by a man who has been wandering around the COP in a T-shirt featuring the tagline "Stay Positive," which also has a boy on it giving a jaunty thumbs up while in the process of being eaten by a shark, which in my mind captures the spirit of COP30 perfectly. It's Tennant Reid. G'day, Tennant.
Why, hello. And various people in the Australian delegation gazed upon that shirt and saw themselves. But I should add that today at the COP, for the crescendo of this Copageddon, I have been sporting the brightest, sunniest, most luridly yellow
Chartreuse
shirt from Brazilian iconic shop and apparent secret sponsor of the Australian COP reception, Farm Rio.
Yeah, to be clear, not sponsoring this podcast.
No.
However,
get in quick though.
Did get a massive shout out at the ministerial reception.
They really did. And I will say this, it's a great shirt. The only thing that people have expressed dissatisfaction with about this shirt is when I have told them that I had opted not to wear the matching shorts to the plenary. I thought that would be disrespectful.
And there was some debate in this very Airbnb on that very point this morning.
Yes.
And we felt that you were letting down the team.
Yeah, I offered to wear my matching set in solidarity. And as it turns out, Tennant, there were a lot more disrespectful acts that went down in that plenary than the absence of chartreuse shorts.
I'm afraid my advice is that the pants were gavelled through and they cannot subsequently be reopened.
Okay, on this week's show, we make our best attempt to sum up what has been an unusually wild roller coaster ride here at COP30 in Belém, Brazil. There is, as they say, too much, but for the purposes of this episode, we'll be digging into where Australia's bid for COP31 landed and the dramatic closing plenary that Tennant and Frankie just experienced in full 3D and surround sound.
Smell-o-vision.
Smell-o-vision. Yes, indeed. The sweat coming off the Russian delegation was...
And the water coming through the roof.
Sure. But let's start with the bid because, we've been on a journey over the last week, gang. Where did we land?
Oh, well...
You could say we landed in the box seat. You could say we landed in the wood chipper.
And there'll be some truth in both of those things?
Yeah. We landed in a complicated place, but with aplomb.
I would certainly say the relationship with Turkey is complicated.
Goodness gracious, how to track back over a very eventful, 48 hours, right?
We should think back to when last we officially spoke with you, the Summerupperers, the Super Summerupperers, and all the Summerupperer adjacent people. And we at that moment had the depths of despair.
That's
on
true.
Hearing Australian media saying it's all over, Australia has given up. And then the haul back of no, stuff's still being negotiated. And then that very night, things were negotiated.
I think, to be fair, that reporting back in Australia that we've given up on the bid didn't make any sense to people that were here on the ground.
There was
in
massive
Berlin.
cognitive dissonance between what was on Channel 9 back in Australia and what we were experiencing on the ground.
And part of that is down to the lack of presence of Australian media here.
Yeah, a little
in
bit.
Berlin. Just a bit.
How many chances in this episode are we going to take to stick the boot into our low-budget Australian media?
Look, I understand low budget is right, and I understand there's challenges, but we have had a fulsome presence at COPs for a number of years now from the Australian media. It's passing strange that the COP immediately before the one that we were anticipating could well be an Australian COP, and where that decision was being made on the ground, this is the one where everybody decides that no, we can't send any senior media to cover it in real time. It's not their fault.
I think just from having chatted to a few, they would have dearly liked to be here.
Individual journos, absolutely, but it is an indictment on the parlour state of the economics of Australian media that this important sort of few days in Australian energy and climate policy was not being properly covered on the ground.
Except by us.
That's right. We did a walking video or two. Digesting our feelings. That's
Indeed.
right. So, okay. So now you've situated us in terms of the last time we talked about it on a channel that, all of you lovely listeners might have tuned into. So I think what sort of became really clear to us on the ground what I love about coming to COPs is that there is very much a Team Australia kind of feeling on the ground. It's really lovely. And I don't know that that's the case for every delegation. I think Australians really kind of bunk in together, and there's a community that, obviously sort of congregates and meets around the pavilion, but also there are just lively kind of group chats and things like that where everyone's kind of keeping each other in the loop and sharing analysis, and it's really nice, actually. I think what sort of became obvious through the various chats we were having with people involved in this negotiation was that it was extremely contested and hard fought, and Turkey came into this COP basically with the position they've had the whole way along, which is we want it and we're not backing down.
Yeah, which, to be fair, having had this experience of Turkey bidding against the UK and Glasgow 5 years ago, in which it appeared to be a process of extracting some concessions in one way, shape or form, there was an assumption from a lot of us that this was a similar process that they were working through.
And that view was strongly encouraged by other nations in the Western Europe and others grouping who were saying, yes, they just want something. It's not the thing they say they want. It's something else. Find out what it is, give them half of it, and they'll roll over. And that proved not to be true at all.
And over the last several months, talking to senior people in the Australian government, they're like, they're not telling us what they want. We're trying.
Yep.
It's really difficult to negotiate when they're not actually putting on the table what their minimum viable deal is, and that it just never appeared.
No, and it seemed to be the case that in Berlin, the sort of starting from a position of no compromise, no deal on the table to be signed off. And what seemed to become clear to us was that they wanted to host it, or they wanted some compromise that saw a split in hosting duties. And I think it was communicated to us that it was made clear that given Australia did have the vast majority of support in that WEOG grouping, like at least 24 of 28 countries on the record saying they supported Australia's bid.
And with the others, as I recall, not vocally supporting Turkiya's bid.
Yeah.
There was no vocal support for Turkiya's bid within that grouping other than very vocally from Turkiya.
So the scenario was put to, to our delegation in questions like, well, why didn't it go to a vote? Like, why didn't we just see all those supporters of Australia vote to confirm us as the host and then, and be done with it, like take that to the plenary? Because, of course, nothing is decided until everything's decided, and so the hosting duties has to be signed off in the final plenary along with everything else. The view was put to us that Turkey had threatened to veto that, like that they would not countenance that.
Yeah, and also I think I've been told that there was a view from Germany as chair of, at present, of the Western Europe and Others grouping that legally they couldn't bring it to a vote. There hadn't been a vote before. These things are typically done on consensus. There are people with a different view of what could have been done, but that was Germany's view, possibly with an eye to their own relationship with Turkey, or to the same concern about leading up to potentially a breach of consensus at the final plenary.
Yeah, and as we're probably going to unpack in some detail related to what happened at the plenary today.
It was eventful.
It was. Like one version of events could have seen them just go ahead with the recommendation for Australia to host and have the Brazilian presidency just gavel that through, because that has happened before on hosting rights. So, yes, Turkey could have said they would object and veto, but sometimes there's a lot of power in the presidency acknowledging or not people wanting to make an objection, that they could have just gavelled that through. And, the response to that kind of scenario was, well, given this has been put forward as the COP of truth and the one that is meant to, like the Brazilian presidency has wanted to use this COP to strengthen and reinforce multilateralism, like that they've been very conscious of that given the absence of the US this year, geopolitical tensions all over the place. They wanted this COP to be an affirmation of multilateralism. And so, the view of the Australian delegation that we spoke to was that, like, that wouldn't work. Like, that would have been a bad signal and an act of bad faith in the process.
And it would have been a bad signal based on what we thought was going to happen as of yesterday.
Yep.
The way that plenary actually worked out, if there was even one additional piece of drama, I think half the room would have exploded.
Yep.
We'll get to that.
Anyway.
So what's in this deal?
So there's a 2-pager.
There is indeed.
What is the deal with the deal?
So effectively, the deal with Turkey sees a new and a novel role being created, which is president of negotiations. And while the COP will be hosted in Antalya, and the COP president will be Turkey, Australia will be the president of negotiations. And I think I should read out this line verbatim: to whom he will delegate the functions of leading the COP31 negotiations for the duration of COP31, and who will have exclusive authority in relation to the negotiations.
Exclusive authority.
Yep.
That's strong language.
And I think necessarily so.
Yeah. And I suppose this is the distinction that's being made between the presidency and the president for negotiations, is that for the substantive work of COP31, Australia's nominated president for negotiations will have exclusive and autonomous carriage of that. Now, there are a lot of conversations happening around the grounds about what exactly that looks like if the president is indeed the president and ultimately holds the gavel. But exclusive is a very strong word.
But I think also what we've got so far is the 2-pager. And there's just a lot of nuance and things that, like, because this particular arrangement is unprecedented, like, there are a lot of dynamics and scenarios that, you know, frankly, won't have been worked through at this point, and will need to be worked through in the coming months. I think it is also useful to highlight. I think I would particularly kind of acknowledge, it seems, the emphasis that Australia in this negotiation put on the role of the Pacific. I think they really went into bat for the Pacific, and what they've extracted through that process is that the pre-COP will be hosted in the Pacific, in one of their countries, to be decided by them and supported by the Australian government. And the idea is that leaders would travel to the region. So I think there were statements along those lines today. Like Chris Bowen said he would welcome global leaders to the Pacific at that COP, and it if done well, could present a critical opportunity to push, particular strategic objectives along. And on the way through, Australia has particularly highlighted the Pacific. It's the Resilience Fund.
The PRF, the Pacific Resilience Facility.
Yeah. So they and I would sort of see that as somewhat analogous to Brazil having launched the Tropical Forest Forever facility here, raising funds for reforestation. And so I think it's significant that the Pacific has that role. I also think we should flag the other things that we don't get in this arrangement that are probably significant to a lot of the stakeholders listening to this. One of the really big parts of COPs, and increasingly so, is the action agenda, which is all the activity that happens throughout the year, generating momentum. And we saw an enormous kind of initiative in the Belém declaration away from fossil fuels pledge that Colombia and Brazil together had led in the lead up to this. Like, that is an example of a flagship initiative of the action agenda that became very much a focus in the end of discussion in negotiations. And so that's the opportunity for business, civil society, others to really kind of play a role in shaping up and getting initiatives off the ground. And sometimes they translate into the negotiations and sometimes they don't. But that the management of the action agenda in this agreement falls to Turkey as president, and that's I think that's not what a lot of Australian stakeholders would have been hoping for.
Yeah, and there's things that are problematic about that division, right? Because as the action agenda becomes more significant, as the energy comes a little bit out of the negotiations, because the Paris rulebook is largely settled. A lot of the momentum in terms of ambition and shifting the needle in terms of our momentum towards maintaining a safe climate is actually driven through the action agenda, but also as a president, as a COP president, it gives you, I guess, all of the buttons and dials on the console to work with across the negotiations and the action agenda, and you can kind of like, lean in on the action agenda and make sure that's complementary or supportive of measures that you're running through the negotiations. And as you say, there are instances where initiatives that start in the action agenda actually make themselves into the final decision text. Now, the premise of this collaboration with Turkey is that there's close collaboration. Yes. So one would hope that the close collaboration extends to thinking very carefully about how the action agenda is feeding into the negotiations, how the negotiations is supporting the action agenda. Yeah. If there is that close collaboration, happy days. But it does add some complexity, which a unitary presidency, if I can put it that way, elides, right?
So to that point, we were sort of started out a bit with the horse race and the intensity of the striving to win. This arrangement will not work at all unless both sides, but definitely us in Australia, are able to put aside everything that happened in this race before the outcome this week. Like if there were high hopes that people had and great ideas and bold plans, and they won't come to pass in the form that they were had, and that is painful for people, and like all kinds of other disruptions to people's lives and work from the outcome here. But sour grapes from this point forward will sour the whole wine barrel of COP31.
And COPs in general, potentially.
Yeah. We'll get to the delicacy of what happened today.
We're certainly at a fragile moment, right? And so the success of COP31 has outsized significance.
Yeah. So I think, I mean, to me that feels like one thing that would and should be a really early focus of the collaborative efforts between Australia and Turkey. Because I think the other thing, and I don't want this to come across as sour grapes at all, but I think one thing that has been reasonably apparent to those of us on the ground is that Turkey, from talking to our officials, has not been staffing up the way the Australian government has in building a team to actually deliver a COP. I think it's interesting that Turkey came here, with a obviously very strong negotiating position, but without apparently having done any much, if any, groundwork on what kind of an action agenda would they pursue if they were successful in prevailing on the hosting rights? Who is the team that's going to deliver on that? Australia's actually done quite a lot of preparatory work, to the extent it's possible to do that. And so it was on the one hand, really positive to hear that Australian officials that had been gearing up to do this work have been reaching out and want to work collaboratively. So I don't think we should I think it's important to be at this point optimistic about what might happen, because everyone involved is pitching, putting themselves forward and trying to make the best of it.
Well, there'll be a lot more to say about COP31, and that story will continue to evolve. There's a lot of flesh to put on those bones. But you two had an interesting day in the negotiations, right? And a box seat for one of the, if not the most dramatic closing plenaries in COP history.
So setting this up slightly, yesterday was a very dramatic day in its way. Following the Great Fire of Thursday, Friday,
the Great Fire of Berlin.
in which there were no casualties.
Well, let's just pause because we've covered this on one of our videos, but we haven't covered it on the podcast because there were quite the scenes. Right?
There were scenes. There was a fire. There was I think we understand an electrical
Fault of some sort.
That caused a fire in the pavilion area.
Yes.
And for anyone who'd looked at footage of the venue, it's all largely temporary structures, really big tents and this sort of plastic net draping stuff that creates a false ceiling, like highly flammable stuff. So a fire kind of happening in that area is like a pretty scary proposition.
Even if you
have an alarm system.
Know. Yeah. So it turned out there were some missing pieces to
just a couple.
Organisation of this pavilion. Fire alarm system? Nope. Public address system?
Nope.
Sprinkler system? Ha. Yeah, it was quite bad. And nobody was seriously hurt, but they sure could have been.
I think they got very lucky. So there were people with small handheld like fire extinguishers. And apparently, there was footage kind of circulating on, the fire and everything like that. But it seems like it was got under control pretty quickly. But
from about 3 p.m. on that Thursday till at least late that night. Well, there was no access for sort of sort out the physical state of the place people for hours and hours and hours.
Well, remember it was they had to declare it under the authority of the local government.
Yeah.
So it ceased being a blue zone, i.e. neutral territory where international negotiations take place. And it was only redeclared a blue zone
in the morning.
Or late in the evening and the morning. And I think the next revision of the text that we saw that we hadn't seen text for days, but that came out at around 3 a.m. the following morning.
Friday morning.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So some people clearly got very little sleep in the production of the 3 a.m. text. Friday was a day of, we can go through the detail of what happened in a minute, but Friday was a day of pretty intense negotiations and consultations for the bulk of that day and into the night. We were sensible people with limited access by that point and went home and slept and arrived for the Saturday closing plenary day, bright-eyed and bushy-tailed, relatively speaking. But the negotiators, some of them had been going all night Friday into Saturday, and Saturday was a long day. So people were very, very, very tired. Certainly some of the key people who didn't get consulted weren't so tired, but the key people were out of their minds.
But I think that, there's something instructive in all of this, right? Because the last version of quite a few texts had appeared on, I think, Tuesday?
Yeah, I think that's right.
Maybe Tuesday, and then nothing. And then it had gone kind of into, so the presidency was going to be doing shuttle diplomacy, so just a lot of meeting with groups privately. And then no one saw text again until Friday morning, which is pretty unusual in a COP. And then obviously the consequence of what that's meant is that there has been an enormous amount of long hours and heavy lifting done by the presidency team, and then these kind of concentrated, sort of shuttle diplomacy meetings behind closed doors, but not a lot of sessions where the issues were allowed to breathe and sort of stakeholders were able to see where things were at.
Which, to remind our listeners, is a bit of an issue given some of the most contentious issues facing the Conference of Parties were being put on the agenda for active negotiation, right?
In that big four. And so one of the things you alluded to in introducing me and being in places where I maybe shouldn't have. But yesterday, so after that text came out, Tennant and I went into the room where a meeting was called for heads of delegation and +1, but initially it was sort of listed as open, to parties and observers. So we went and scouted out a spot because we decided that was where the action was going to be for the day.
Where it happens.
The room where it happens.
The room where it happens.
And oh boy, was it. And so I found myself able to stay in that room for a 4-hour discussion, which in hindsight you can draw a straight line to what happened in the plenary today based off the dynamics seen in that room.
And were they great dynamics? Smiles and sunshine?
They were not deep kind of rifts and divisions. So parties were not happy with the text that came out at 3 a.m. in the morning.
Parties were about as happy as the dogs in this neighbourhood.
That's right. Colour and movement, guys. Yeah, you saw the EU very unhappy at the lack of ambition on NDCs, and the fossil fuel language had been taken out. I think they somewhat unhelpfully started that muchirao, like the thing that the Big Four evolved into, this gathering of parties to solve problems. That's what the muchirao means. And kind of put a quid pro quo on the table at the very start by saying we will be more flexible on adaptation finance if you move on ambition. And that set the Arab group and LMDC grouping right off, and saw them, invoking historical contexts and, oh, you want ambition? Like, you guys are responsible for all of the historical emissions, and yet you've set net zero targets around 2050 when the global effort needs to be getting there. You should be net zero by 2030 and net negative pretty soon after. So it descended into a very argumentative and unhelpful dynamic. And then you had parties like Colombia come in and say, we cannot accept this text. You've removed any reference to fossil fuel phase out. We've got 80 countries signed up to our declaration or transition roadmap away from fossil fuels. We absolutely will not support this text unless you revise it. And then that set off the other side. And then they ended up, the presidency put in this kind of position where people were just restating positions they'd clearly been giving into the presidency privately, and it wasn't going anywhere. And so they tried to form huddles in the room, forcing groups to come together and refine options on 3 issues, trade, finance, and NDC's ambition. And the group who wanted to see a focus on fossil fuels said, we want 4 huddles. And the presidency's like, there are 80 countries on either side of this debate. It's not going to happen. We're not going to get consensus on that. I'll talk to you separately about that. And he wanted the 3 huddles. And then the EU said, well, and because this was led by the Arab group really in the room, well, if they don't want to huddle on fossil fuels, we don't want to huddle on trade. We don't agree. And then the president had called a break. So he was moderating this muchirao. Took a break, came back and said, we're done here. I'm going to meet with negotiating blocks, only 2 reps per block. Come to my office at 5 p.m. This is at 3 o'clock or after 4 hours of this. and we'll decide where to go to from there. And that was really the last time we saw anything from parties until today in the plenary.
And I think we should say that this is all in the context of some very highfalutin words from the presidency earlier in the COP, saying, well, this is where we come together. Mm-hmm. This is where we show that multilateralism is has a beating heart, and that we can resolve our differences and power through and kind of demonstrate to the world that this process is still able to deliver effective outcomes on climate change, which is great. If indeed it does that, if, parties respond to the rallying cry. But if it descends into bickering within hours...
Yeah, if you say come together or this is the end for multilateralism and then people don't come together, then you've declared it, you've called it, that's the end of multilateralism. And that couldn't be allowed to happen.
No.
But it very nearly did.
Well, so can I just, I've been processing what we've just witnessed over the last 24 hours, over the last few hours since we left the venue. And, I think just sort of stepping back a little bit here, they set themselves an extraordinarily hard task here in strategizing the way they did at the start of the COP by wanting to avoid a fight up front about what goes on the agenda. And then they put the 4 most contentious, difficult issues into this side chat that then evolved into where the cover text was being negotiated. I'm like, that was clearly a strategic choice and strategy that they did that. And to do that in a year where the US is not here, the multilateral process is under some strain, and you lack the weight historically maybe you've had of groups that reinforce multilateralism in that context. And they took, at least from what I can see and what others have said to me, they took a lot behind closed doors. And that kind of works against what they've, I guess, tried to espouse through this COP about this being the COP of truth and that and transparency, and it's sort of been suggested to me that there was some arrogance in that, and that based on what we saw this morning, that strategy clearly didn't work for them, that they've not gone far enough to consult with groups that we saw bring tactics into a plenary session today, and that could have been managed differently beforehand.
And this part of it makes, and that Friday Muchirao session makes a really interesting contrast with 2023 in Dubai and the much ballyhooed Majlis setting, which happened twice, and which it was the presidency trying to shake up discussions that were quite stuck, getting parties around the inner circle around a lack of a table, where they needed to speak directly to each other without notes, which they didn't all quite manage, and shake it up and have people telling truths at each other in a direct way. And this Muchirao room, collective effort room, it was everybody in a circle, but with traditional negotiating tables in front of them. I didn't really see anything particularly different about that room.
It's a giant negotiating room, a bigger table than usual.
And there were 2 modes that I saw. One mode where people were called in, and because things had been sort of cooked up before, nobody said anything after the presidency said something. Or 2, they opened the floor and things fell apart without real communication.
I think the other thing that also seemed to tip people off at the start of that Muchirao session was that and this happened twice in the week, when the presidency released text, it was close to, like, it was sort of presented as final text, you know, like not many brackets, like not much kind of options for parties to negotiate on. It was like here's a final version. Do you accept it?
And their stated intention originally was to, earlier this week, was to close the political issues off on the Wednesday.
Before everything caught on fire.
Yes, that's right. There was a delay in achieving that ambition, and then the COP caught on fire, and then there were some further delays in achieving that ambition, and ultimately all the issues closed on Saturday.
So putting out sort of some very, can I say, opinionated text at that point of the COP might have flown if they'd done a whole lot of groundwork, right, with the various parties.
Well, they had been doing a lot of work, but I think what became very obvious in that room was that, you know, and I think this has disappointed many parties, particularly groups like the EU, even though that wasn't as evident as it might have been today, that, you know, like Brazil holding the presidency, hosting a COP in Belém, the Amazon, like at the mouth of the Amazon rainforest, the presidency had really kind of let out on a couple of issues it wanted to champion through the year. The reforestation piece, the fossil fuel transition piece. They had been very strong on that as a presidency, and what emerged through the course of the week was that the side they seemed to be sympathising more with in the text that was being put out was very much more aligned with the BRICS, LMD, like sort of Arab groupings. The text was weak when it came to ambition, and so it was not balanced in the right way, and so then it just led to all this really unhelpful dynamic.
And that was the view, that lack of balance was not just the view of like wealthy, often environmentally minded developed countries. That was a view that we heard from a lot of Latin American countries, especially in the closing plenary, but vehemently calling in the session that you observed, Frankie, and subsequently Colombia leading a lot of countries in calling for language on transition away from fossil fuels and the need for a roadmap for that. The roadmap idea had been floated by the president of Brazil, like the actual president of the country.
Like Lula had been personally championing it. So you can understand why those particularly other Latin American countries were deeply disappointed when them holding the presidency failed to yield anything that was, you know, close to having ambition in it.
And of course, the Brazilian presidency didn't give up on that, like just on a lark. There was absolutely trenchant resistance to any mention whatsoever of fossil fuels, let alone a transition away from them, particularly from the Arab group. Broader resistance on elevating mitigation from the like-minded developing countries. And like they were absolutely clear, Arab group in particular, red line. Any mention, any singling out of energy sources or industries, red line, unacceptable.
Which you can understand being frustrating to the groups wanting to push that, wanting to progress the conversation, because we had a COP28 hosted in Dubai with the UAE as presidency that introduced fossil fuel language for the very first time. And so, like, I think, you know, maybe what's now kind of much clearer, I think, is that there is a very concerted effort to walk back that effort. And you've seen, led by the Arab group in particular at this COP, red lines drawn on any mention of fossil fuel or energy, transition in energy systems. Like that is a push to walk back language that was introduced a couple of years ago. And I think, they can see the weakness in the process because there's not the US is not there. And very interestingly, like the EU was not as strong as I think historically they've been. And it was, anyway.
Well, EU politics is more fragmented than it has been for a long time. There's a lot roiling through that union and a lot more dissent. I also think that the efforts that were made in Baku to kind of like build an implementation agenda around tripling renewables and doubling energy efficiency and transition away from fossil fuels, that kind of fell apart, but did so relatively quietly. Yeah. Whereas this next year, a couple of years on, it's been a very public blow up around the salience of that language that was incredibly significant in the UAE consensus. But we've been talking around the blockbuster closing plenary, right? Like there was a lot going on in there. You guys had ringside seats. Take us through it.
Just like most days, we queued early.
Yeah, that's the superpower.
Yeah.
Queue early.
So I think, we didn't know really what to expect. I mean, text dropped. Oh, what time this morning?
While we were
text
sitting
drop?
in the room, like the text on the
that's true. Yeah.
the Muchirao decision, where the four most controversial issues, or so we thought, the four most controversial was contained. Didn't wind up dropping until after the time when the plenary was originally meant to start. It was meant to start at 10 a.m. It got sort of going like 1-ish.
Yeah. It dragged out, and you saw all like a bunch of other texts come out, and the Muchirao was like one of the last things that dropped.
Yeah.
And then so I think we were scaling through that, and
as were the parties.
Yep. Because just to kind of recap that, right? Like where we left things the previous day, the presidency was like, I'm going to deal with negotiating blocks directly, and only like 2 reps per block. So there was not a whole party process overnight. It was sort of very contained set of negotiations. What was obvious was that the president hadn't slept, and a lot of people hadn't slept overnight, and so parties were racing to get across
hadn't
it.
Slept. Chris Bowen had been negotiating all night long.
Yeah,
and so queuing it up then. The plenary finally gets going. The meeting where all the decisions are going to be introduced and then gavelled through, and statements are going to be made on how people feel about all that. And things start out with the president just introducing a bunch of the initial agenda items, including the Muchirao and items on the Global Goal on Adaptation, on the Mitigation Work Program, on a number of other things. He gavels through the Muchirao decision like in a heartbeat. He does the just transition decision. Thunderous applause from a lot of people who were very excited about just transition, and there was a push for a particular mechanism around just transition that wasn't 100% realised, I think, at this conference, but people were excited enough about that. And then he gavelled through a couple of other items, and those were the Global Goal and Adaptation, where a bunch of indicators for how will we know if the global goal and adaptation is being met were part of that decision. And also the mitigation work program, which is like a long-running train wreck, really, of trying to put some additional ambition into, like, how is mitigation going and what more can we do, gavelled those through, and then a lengthy and vehement parade of interventions framed as points of order came from mostly Latin American countries, and they were saying a few things in those.
Well, it was mostly focused. So I think it led off with Panama.
Yeah.
It was mostly focused on adaptation.
Yeah,
initially.
GGA.
Yeah, and so we haven't spent much time talking about this so far through the COP, but the work program on adaptation was largely going to be like more of a technical exercise. So we got to work on indicators. So like adaptation, there was a very technical process that had been running for like 2 years at this point, and there was a series of like 100 indicators that had been put together, and I think maybe too ambitiously also. The goal was to agree a set of indicators out of this COP, but it was clear, obviously through the process, that there wasn't that there was a lot of work that still needed doing.
And during, I think, the intercessional in Bonn, overnight, the list of 100 had been whittled down or consolidated or monkeyed with to become a list of, I think, 57. And nobody professed to be happy with those 57.
Well, at least what I had heard was that there was work done through the COP, like overnight, with people, not much sleep, not by experts, so like by the negotiators, to strip these indicators back to a list of like around 60 or something. But they were like, and like all the interventions that we heard were like, these don't make any sense. Like they completely throw out the window all the technical work that's happened over the last 2 years. Like these indicators are not workable. And so there was objection to that. But I also think there was, and not that this was voiced necessarily, but there was objection, like there had been tensions around adaptation finance as well through the whole discussion. That didn't seem to feature prominently in these interventions. It started to be clear that whilst, like I think we've seen over the last couple of COPs, that there's this dynamic that's emerged where the president will gavel through like the big decision or the big contentious thing and kind of expect some like kabuki theatre from parties that he knows are not happy with the outcome, and they'll make interventions and say, we're really not happy, we can't accept this.
But they don't really want to stop the whole process. They just want to put themselves on record, coincidentally, just too late to stop it. And that's maybe what he thought was happening.
Yeah. And then I think by the time we got to like 4 or 5 of these interventions, we got to, I think, it was Panama and Colombia. And I think it's also really significant that these set of interventions, like it wasn't exclusively Latin American countries, but like the other countries that share the South American continent. So like there's a lot of pretty rich kind of symbolism in like
Argentina, Chile, Panama,
carrying their peers with them.
Uruguay, Paraguay, Colombia.
Yeah. All interventions from these countries. And I think it got to Colombia that said on a point of order, I think, and the objection was like they had raised their flag to speak before the gavel was put down. You did not acknowledge me. We were not allowed to speak, and the speaker said we object.
And remember, this is all in the context of very explicitly stating multilateralism is what is on the ballot here, and the idea that we can all get together and kind of find these collective outcomes. And so their own peers within Latin America are saying, well, you're not listening to us on this point that is incredibly important to us, and that sort of kind of spiraled very quickly into a conversation around, well, it's gavelled through, and there's this whole legalistic conversation, like, can we sort of circle back to this? And the answer is obviously no. But like that interaction in itself is quite damaging, right?
It was pretty wild. So like it got to like that particular, it was like the second intervention from Colombia that, I mean, Janet, you were taking very detailed notes about what they were saying, like verbatim.
Usually my notes on this stuff are tediously detailed. These ones are a little too exciting.
Yeah, but the woman who was speaking for Colombia said, you've given us no choice
but to object to the mitigation work program unless a modification is made. And she named a change, which was inserting fossil transition into a particular part of the Mutirao decision, which clearly would be unacceptable to the Arab group based on very obviously stated positions.
But it was interesting because obviously all of the interventions that had come were disagreement on the adaptation work. And so she just effectively upped the ante in the room by saying, well, if you don't insert this line on fossil fuel transition into the Mutirao, we object to the mitigation work program. And at that point, the president suspended the session.
He had one more go at saying what he had been saying, which was, thank you for your intervention. What you've said will be noted and entered in the record. And Uruguay said in Spanish, this procedure is unacceptable. We raised our nameplate before you gavelled because we wished you to consider what we said for us and others. What do you say about this? And then there were like urgent consultations by the president, and then they suspended the proceedings for what felt like 45 minutes, maybe more, while legal advice was sought. And then, like, there was an outcome, but then some of the fireworks really began.
Yeah. So he kind of commenced by, sort of, I guess, confirming that he'd had legal advice, which was items that have been gavelled through are adopted. There was no backtracking on that. And then he tried to...
No backsies. No in the UNFCCC conference of parties.
I mean, he did try...
That's what the lawyers say.
Yeah. And they'd clearly been in huddles in the room, like his negotiators in huddles with the parties that had been objecting, but then also the ones that were going to have an issue with anything that happened from here on out, like the Arab group. And so he tried to offer some kind of a way forward or compromise by saying, like, the work the detailed work on the adaptation stuff will continue in next session.
And I propose that the CMA...
Yeah.
And that's as far as he got before the Russians... So this was the most extraordinary thing I've ever heard at a COP from a diplomat. The Russian head of delegation, was it? Or was it a minister?
Have been. I don't think it was a minister.
I don't think a minister would speak that much Spanish.
I think it would have been like the head negotiator. Yeah.
So he intervened to raise a point of order in like the most unhelpful way possible. The president was in the process of trying to calm the waters, smooth things over, offer a way forward that was going to be mutually acceptable. And Russia came in and said, I don't know why these Latin American countries are making these interventions in English. I will speak to them in Spanish so that they understand me. And he switched to fluent Spanish and said that you've had, like, it's inconceivable that you raise all these objections at this minute. You've had all this time to do it. If my comrades and colleagues from Latin America have understood me correctly, don't behave like children who want to get their hands on all the sweets and stuff them down their throats. Our delegation thinks the president succeeded in steering us through turbulent waters with consummate skill when all of our behaviour was lacking at times. I thank him for his work." And he went on for a while and then concluded, "Apologies for the length, but I find it difficult to be succinct," in Spanish.
I'm sure this brought all of the Latin American countries on board, and they saw the error of their ways.
That's right.
I think the stocks of Russia in Spanish-speaking Latin America may have taken something of a hit today.
Well, very helpful of him.
You don't understand what people say to you. You're greedy children and your language is stupid, is I believe what Russia said today.
And not only that, said it in Spanish so it could run on all the evening news bulletins.
That's right. It was like Bond villain tier, consummate bastardry.
It was appalling, though.
It felt like an attempt to at least deliberately humiliate that entire continent's worth of delegations, and maybe an attempt to just like give the whole process a bit of a push and see if it did collapse. Remarkable restraint, I thought, was shown by the Latin American delegation. Like, they responded, but like they had like so's your face type short responses, and then they moved on.
Yeah. It was pretty extraordinary though, and I think like the fact that things sort of descended to that level in the room shows that like something frayed today in the process.
Yeah.
Oh, we should talk about India though. Just for people who are like long-term consumers of COP closing plenary telenovela.
And India always gives good closing statements.
They really do.
Like memorable. I'd say
watch.
memorable is the right word.
Or there are collective gasps that go up when you hear who's in the speaking order. And like when India comes up, you're like, oh. And then, you know, Russia and Arab groups similarly.
But this time, so they came in after Russia. They were quite diplomatic compared to Russia. I mean, you know, so would somebody with a machine making fart noises be. India came in and said that you don't try and unpick decisions after they've been gavelled through, and that they had strenuously disliked and spoken unfavourably of some previous decisions, and this was the drama last year in Baku over the new collective quantified goal on finance. That was gavelled through super rapidly, and India came up after and say this is a terrible process and it's a joke and all of this. And there was this doubt afterwards, were they doing kabuki or were they really, really serious that they would have killed this if they had the chance? And what they said today at least was they would never kill it, like after it's been gavelled through. And whatever they said was like expressive. Is that true? It's what they said today. And so I guess, I don't know, they've retroactively spoiled last year's drama, but they were saying be adults, I guess, in their own way. They did make a child reference. Like they said, children have to grow up.
Yeah.
Thanks a lot.
Yeah. There was an edge in some of what was said there. So
noting that the what the Latin American countries were calling for was for global goal and adaptation process to not be just randomly like random reductions and substitutions of text, and on mitigation that we actually talk about one of the biggest elements of transition,
which has already been introduced, and so shouldn't be the thing that dare not speak its name in these conversations.
It was like procedurally aggressive behaviour from the Latin American countries, but childish it was not.
No. So, I mean, we focused a lot on the dynamics in the room. We haven't really talked about, like, the package of stuff that was actually agreed, because, like, I think from then on out it was pretty smooth sailing and the drama kind of subsided.
I think people were emotionally exhausted.
Yeah, and like the president himself in apologizing and sort of explaining away or, like the next steps, he's like, I'm old. I'm tired. I've not slept. I'm also old.
I've aged many years in the last 6 hours.
Anyway, he was like trying to situate himself for people in the room, like that he was clearly like, I would say he showed like quite a lot of like restraint and patience in that session.
A beautiful way of saying it. I would say that President Dolago ate an entire high tea of shit sandwiches up on that dais today.
Yeah.
And said, yum, yum.
It was kind of remarked to me during the break whether his presidency would be tenable through the rest of the year after this, noting the just how upset some parties clearly were with how some of this had been managed to date. I'm not sure that maybe it'll be okay, but also
Russia's got his back.
Well,
and that's worth a lot.
Yeah. But that's significant to think about too, particularly for Australia and Turkey, because what's also been made kind of clear to us in talking to people is that it's going to take a bit of hand-holding and support for Turkey to step up as host, and the absence of if Brazil said, oh well, the COP's over, we're done, we're just going to pass the baton. There's still quite a lot of uncertainty in the arrangement that they're handing stuff on to, and so shepherding of that is important.
It really, really is, and especially because one of the ways that Brazil was seeking to diffuse the anger over the lack of any language related to transition away from fossil fuels within the text of these decisions was to say that they would launch a roadmap on transitioning away and participate in a major global conference in Colombia in 2026 about that. They are going to shepherd that into existence in the absence of any text signed off by the COP. So they're going to have to be pretty active and creative to make anything of that. Is the next COP going to be able? I mean, we'll talk in a future episode about what the dynamics are for next COP. But is the next COP going to be able to do anything with whatever that text is? You'd think it will struggle to, based on the positions of a number of parties this fortnight.
I mean, any sort of wide-scale agreement around the status of fossil fuels and, their phase out or the pace of the transition, it's going to be incredibly difficult to shepherd that through, a consensus process at this point.
Yeah, well, with the dynamics that we've got at the moment, yes, absence of US being a force for ambition, in this forum, the EU presenting kind of fragmented. I was very disappointed. Peers and colleagues who travelled from the EU to be in Berlin were I heard a lot of disappointment expressed at how they showed up in these talks. The intriguing one is China and whether and how they position.
Guardian of process, China.
Well, so what is interesting, right? Now this is a detailed point, but I'm fascinated by it, so I'm going to talk about it. So China's obviously part of the G77 plus China grouping, but also affiliate.
Really?
All right, Reid. But tends to align with the LMDC grouping more broadly, and like-minded
developing countries.
And India speaks for that negotiating bloc most of the time. In the Muchirao session yesterday, when the presidency was trying to rescue the show and break people into huddles to discuss, to sort of work amongst themselves to discuss how they could make changes to the text, he actually called on and nominated countries, and in some cases there were ministers in the room, to lead those huddles. He called on the UK to lead the finance huddle. He called on the EU to lead the NDC ambition huddle, and he called on China to lead the trade huddle. Now that didn't play out in the end. It didn't happen. But in that room over the course of the week, you saw China make interventions that were much more conciliatory in tone, like actually about the we need to work together, kind of like reinforcing the multilateralism piece. And what's kind of interesting to think about the place that we're in at the moment is that there is a bit of there's a space that could be filled in a leadership capacity there. And so there's a question is China even capable of stepping up and doing that? But if they wanted to, they probably could. So it's fascinating to kind of see what we have been talking about in other contexts on this pod at the moment, right? Like the dominance of China in the tech space, in the pace of the rollout of renewables and all of that, starting to kind of subtly manifest itself here in climate talks is very interesting to think about.
And I suppose speaks to the reality that when you change a social dynamic in negotiations or in any other kind of human social context, you vacate a space and it shifts the positionality of everybody in that space and gives the opportunity for individual actors to occupy a new space, right? US has vacated that space. China's trying it on, seeing if this is a space that they want to occupy. And it could be an interesting development if they choose to take on that role as the guardian of multilateralism. That would, I think, be productive in the current context.
Yeah. I mean, it's sort of very early days, but even just to see that subtle maybe it's even a little more than subtle, but just to see that shift this year is fascinating. I guess just in sort of thinking about putting a bow on that is like, what have we actually landed with? So we've got a Muchirao text that is pretty weak on ambition. Like there's no reference to fossil fuels. There are some commitments to processes to take forward on a few of those big four tracks. So we've got a global implementation accelerator thing which I think is the response to how do we strengthen NDCs in these years between the 5-year NDC cycle. So how do we strengthen that? And that's got to be carried forward by the Brazilian presidency and the Turkey presidency with the partnership of Australia. That's a this COP and next COP presidency joint thing.
There was a reference in this part of the decision to acknowledging past decisions, including the outcome of the Dubai COP, which includes the global stock take, which includes paragraphs including transition away from fossil fuels. So they like
a very oblique reference.
Dagger, asterisk.
Yeah. Several protective layers of abstraction and for exampleness away is the closest they could get after unbelievably tense negotiations.
Just put a Wikipedia link in the footnote to fossil fuels.
Yeah.
Well, and not even that.
Maybe next year it will be, this decision takes place on the same planet as
where the UAE consensus happened.
Yeah. What's in it? Nobody will say anymore. Well, many parties will.
What a consensus that was.
Oh, my God.
Look, I do think it's important that we just quickly highlight the other things that were agreed in this package. One of them is on a notional tripling of adaptation finance.
Yes.
But I think it's like, I think developed countries would walk away from this understanding that to mean within the context of the new collective quantified goal on finance.
Yes.
So not additional to the 300 billion agreed last year.
And I believe that developed countries will say, and the tripling is from the same base as the previously agreed doubling.
So not a tripling of the double.
No. But opinions will differ from others.
Opinions will differ. The other one that got the most significant cheer in the room, I think, for the individual items that were gavelled through and not contested, was the just transition work. And that includes agreement on a just transition, like an institutional mechanism to work with parties on just transition. This was a concept that had been championed all the way through by civil society organisations here, and they had termed the thing that they were after as the BAM, the Belém Action Mechanism. So it feels like, and I think they ended up getting the G77 over the line. Like, I think that's what carried it through earlier in the piece. But anyway, so like, look, lots of details TBC in that. It's another kind of institutional response.
Yeah. And paragraph 25 of, well, that decision, if I've read the right version of the text, and we're in the twilight zone really here as we record. The work of fleshing out that mechanism is all to come, and I believe there will be a decision to be proposed and then taken at COP31 next year on the fleshing out of that mechanism. Will it be something that is really substantively effective and taken up? Will it be yet another front in the we can't do much without money, give us money argument?
That view has been expressed to me.
Yes.
Yep.
Will it not be agreed next year?
Yep. We'll see.
We will see.
So, and other things that were agreed and welcomed were the gender action plan. So there was work on
with asterisks.
With asterisks, and this is when you know that you're in a room with very diverse views on lots of things when it comes to
the Holy See has entered the chat.
The Holy See makes an intervention to say, for the record, we'd like it noted that when we talk about gender,
boys wear blue and girls wear pink,
and that's all there is.
Yeah. And they weren't alone in doing that. A few other countries wanted their views on that noted for the record, but no objections. And I think we've touched on the fossil fuel roadmap being a thing that the presidency will lead. He's also going to do something on reforestation, like roadmap. A separate or another roadmap there. The other things though that out of that kind of big four that they've created some process around and maybe staved off some disagreement on is your pet topic, Tennant.
Trade.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so where they got to on this one is there had been a bunch of options that were being negotiated, and one of them was super EU language, and one of them was super LMDC and unacceptable to the EU language, and one of them was not much use to anybody in the world, and one of them was composed of two parts. Just reiterate like 33-year-old text from the UN Framework Convention itself, saying basically don't do bad discriminatory trade practices under the disguise of climate measures. And say we will have a series of dialogues at the intersessionals over the next 3 years to 2028, and then we will have in the final version that was adopted a big high-level forum on the issues around trade and climate. It was pretty non-specific. There was no reference in this text to the dreaded unilateral trade measures, nor the EU language of climate measures with a cross-border impact, and a report by the Secretariat after all that about like what was said and learned. And so that doesn't resolve anybody's views directly. There is the possibility that all these dialogues will actually involve people like talking and listening to each other, preferably involving people who know anything at all. And to that end, it's not just parties, but others, including the World Trade Organization, the UN trade arm, and others who will be involved. And so there's the possibility that there's actually some learning and growing and meeting of minds and opening of hearts. And if not, there will be a blow up in 3 years' time.
Well, it has been your theory of the case that if people of goodwill just got together and talked through this stuff, they would be significantly calmed.
That's right. And look, I continue to believe that. And to that point, I had just some great side chats while we were waiting for things to happen in the plenary room with people who had both some strong priors on EU CBAM and its impacts, but also some elements of it that they hadn't really considered before. And they raised some good points and I raised some good points, and we agreed to talk more with each other. And that's the kind of conversation you can have in some contexts. If you're set up for just a forum that can only produce the recitation of talking points in a shouty voice between people who didn't write the talking points, that is no good to anybody. But real conversations actually are valuable. So it's not a completely utopian idea that we could talk things out.
Well, it's been a long day. It's been a long 2 weeks. It's getting relatively late here at our Airbnb in Belém, and we've got to get up early and head to the airport back to
reality.
Back to reality. Sure. Certainly back to Australia. If that constitutes reality, then that's where we're going.
I devoutly hope that it does.
Yep.
Look, I want to close with a question for both of you, which is, the Brazil presidency took it upon itself to put multilateralism on the ballot, and we've had a couple of fairly messy examples of multilateralism, both in terms of the resolution of the COP31 bid and, an ambitious attempt to grapple with some of the big issues facing the Conference of Parties over many years now, but landing in a pretty fractious closing plenary. How are you feeling about the good ship UNFCCC as we close COP30?
I think the good ship took on a lot of water in recent days, and the bilge pumps will need to be operating overtime for at least the next 12 months.
Yeah, I think Chris Bowen and the Australian delegation have watched very closely how the Brazilian presidency handled these negotiations, and they're very experienced people in this context. And I think there are some clear learnings and indications that they would approach things differently. And so I think they set themselves a really ambitious task, and they tried some things that didn't work, and it might have made some dynamics worse. But I think we've got a really good team of people that know their stuff in this space, and I'm sure are going to make every effort that we don't see something like that play out here. So I don't know. I think some things are beyond, there are global dynamics at play at these talks. It's not just about the climate of it all in these rooms, and I think we sort of need to remind ourselves of that occasionally. But I think to the extent that a presidency can play a role in that, I think this has been a study in some things maybe not to do.
Multilateralism needs a hero, and his name's Chris Bowen.
Let's then not play Tina Turner at this point. That's the perspective of somebody who's relishing the wasteland. So obviously that song is wrong. We do need another hero, and we've got one.
All right. That is our show for today. This podcast was edited by Energy Professional and Podcast Tragic Mark Spencer from Here Media Studio. Coming to you from Belém, Brazil, COP30. Possibly the last of our COP30 themed podcasts, but making no promises. For Frankie Muscovich and Tennant Reid, I'm Luke Menzel. Thanks for listening, and we'll talk to you again soon.